Brace yourself for an epic event. Today we will be traveling way back in time to see the origins of American history. And no, I'm not talking about when you know who sailed the ocean blue, whoop de frickin' do, or the American Revolution, or Pilgrims and the Mayflower, none of that jazz, because none of that is anywhere near the start of American history, as we will see moving forward. In this lecture, we will not only look at the first Americans, looking at how historians explain their arrival to the Americas, and look at how different individuals settled throughout the Americas, but we'll also in the process grapple with this concept of using the terminology of the New World to describe North and South America. In all of these lectures moving forward, we'll be looking at a bit of context. Then we'll look at the first Americans, again, looking at how different people settled in different parts of the Americas. And then lastly, we'll look around the continents to see where and how different groups of people were settled by the time Europeans arrived. And we need to understand that the groups we look at are nowhere near all the groups in the Americas by that time, and that there had been individuals settled there between the time that these first Americans arrived and the time we're looking at in 1492. Okay, so a lot of history had developed and played out by the time you know who sailed the ocean blue. All right, so the New World is used as a term to refer to the Americas. Sometimes Australia gets mixed up in this as well. The Old World is used typically to refer to Africa, Asia, and Europe. And this is all the result of a very Eurocentric perspective through which Europeans arrived in the Americas long after they'd been settled in this area here, and therefore said, oh, this is a new world because we've never been here. So it's suddenly a new world. All right. And that terminology is just stuck. It's used in scholarly studies, also in pop culture. But so let's think about this like this. All right, say I've never been to your neighborhood, wherever that may be, wherever it is that you live, I've never been there. And I just show up one day and I say, I am here in the name of my great majesty, King Bartleby, Baloney Bolognese, Oliver Oil Tatum, who was my cat, by the way. And I say, I now declare this land which I have now discovered territory of that great king, and I now establish dominion over this new world that I have discovered. Well, you and your neighbors who have been living there for quite some time are going to look at me like, what is this dude on? He didn't discover anything, first of all. There's nothing new about this neighborhood. We've been living here for God knows how long. We're all set in our ways, doing our things. We have history in our homes here. We've had experiences in this neighborhood. Who is this guy to just show up and say that this is something new? First of all, it doesn't make any sense. Secondly, he didn't discover anything. Third, how the hell is he going to try to claim dominion over this just by saying that some king who we have no idea who he's talking about now has rule over us? And we got to pay tribute to him? You got another thing coming, all right? So keep all that in mind as we move forward. Reality we need to grapple with is by the time Europeans arrived to the Americas, they were heavily populated, okay? So this map here shows us North America, most of North America. We need to keep in mind that even further up north here, there were groups of people settled, as well as further down here into South America. And what we see here, all these different colors represent different language groups of indigenous peoples who were living in the Americas by 1492. And that's just language groups. Within each of these language groups, there's various nations. And in a lot of these nations, there's various bands or tribes of kinship groups settled throughout the Americas, right? So they're very populated couple of continents who had very diverse, complicated methods of living, depending on the region or climate of where they were by the time Europeans arrived. Really complicating that idea of this being a new world by that point in time. All right, so let's try to understand how these first Americans got here, where they came from. They came from over in Asia, an area known as Siberia, right on the other side of the globe here. So what we're seeing here is Alaska would be somewhere around this area, but this is showing us that there was an ice age around 12,000 years ago. And during that ice age, this territory between Alaska and the mainland, North America, and Siberia here was all frozen over. There was this big icy land bridge referred to as Beringia, and people began crossing over from Beringia into North America. And the theory is that this all started with a bunch of hunting trips. All right, it's the kind of long-standing theory that's been around for quite some time. These people were pursuing large mammals, things like woolly mammoths, giant bison, mastodon, etc., across Beringia here into North America. And over time, they would pursue other game further south and into other regions. Some of them moved further down to try to get into warmer climates. And we had people gradually traveling into North America and settling throughout the continents. And then eventually, of course, this ice age ended. This icy land bridge here melted off and is no longer there. But this theory has been complicated a little bit, and a lot of historians now propose that instead of American history starting with a bunch of hunting trips, it actually started with a series of boating trips, then some hunting trips. All right, and this isn't just historians going and changing our history to try to confuse the younger generations. No, we have new evidence that we need to grapple with. All right, so along some of the coastal areas in North America, there have been artifacts discovered that date back to about 20,000 years ago. All right. That would mean that those artifacts that were evidence of humans being in this area were there long before this ice age had occurred, which formed Beringia. Okay. That means there were people in the Americas before anybody was able to walk across. So, using the evidence of what we know about the peoples in these areas, okay, we know that they were great mariners, meaning that they had big boats that they would paddle around and were pretty skilled at doing so even in some of these rougher waters along the coast here. So the theory is perhaps some of these people boated here early on, right? Long before anybody started crossing the land bridge to hunt. Clear example there of how we have conflicting interpretations of history that can be complicated based on what evidence we have at hand. All right, so now that we understand how the first Americans got here, we understand that there was a very large population of diverse groups of people settled throughout the Americas by the time Europeans arrived in 1492. I want to go ahead and take a look at some of those groups and see just how they were living and see that this was a thriving set of continents, North and South America. All right, so we'll start by looking into Central and South America. Those are the regions here marked in yellow. Talking about Mexico and pretty much everything further south of that. In Central and South America, we had some centralized empires. Empire we can understand as a nation or a society that exerts its power through imperialism, right? So again, an empire we can understand as a nation or society that exerts its power through imperialism. All right, but then we got to ask, what is imperialism? We can simply understand imperialism as when one nation or society forcefully expands its influence onto other nations or societies. Again, that's when one nation or society forcefully expands its influence onto other nations or societies. It's a pretty simple definition of imperialism. And an empire is any nation who uses that to exert its power. And that's absolutely what we saw going on here with some of these nations in Central and South America. All right, groups like the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. They had these extensive empires that stretched out well beyond their kind of central regions. All right, they were collecting tribute from peoples all around them in the form of labor or resources. We look, for example, to the Aztecs here in their capital city of Tenochtitlan. People in all kinds of surrounding areas were having to give up food and resources as well as labor to the emperor and the other members of the political leadership here in Tenochtitlan. As you might imagine, that was going to lead to a good bit of resentment. Hold that thought. That'll be important moving forward. And as we can see by looking at this image here of Tenochtitlan, these empires in Central and South America had very extravagant capital cities. The Incas as well had a pretty extravagant city in the Andes Mountains called Cusco. And these capital cities had very extensive road networks and waterways coming in and out of them. These were not only so that people could travel in and out of the cities, but also so the tribute could be sent in to the central political forces. There was also very extensive architecture in these capital cities and in other parts of the empire as well. Things like pyramids, temples, and these were used for advanced religious customs including in some cases human sacrifice. Again, as you might imagine, some of these people who have been taken over by these groups like the Aztecs and Incas, who are having to give up people to be sacrificed sometimes, are really going to have a lot of resentment as a result of that. Again, hold that thought. I do want to grapple, though, real quick with this concept of human sacrifice. Europeans argued that this was so foreign and backwards and savage, and that they use this as part of their justification for coming in and conquering groups like the Aztecs. And a lot of people moving forward still make these same kind of arguments. They look back at this and say, well, gosh, these people were so backwards. They were literally killing other human beings. As a form of sacrifice. I can absolutely understand that to an extent. I am no fan of sacrificing a life for any means if it's not absolutely necessary. And we need to understand, though, what they're doing here is they're sacrificing people to their gods because they believed that that would please their gods and create safer and more favorable conditions for their society as a whole. Their gods would do things like ensure that there was extensive rainfall, good food production, that they would be safer in terms of being protected from enemies. Okay. So by sacrificing some lives, they think that they're providing a better, safer life for their communities as a whole. We do some very similar things in the 21st century, even in the Western world, and even in the good old US of A. While not exactly the same, we do practice elements of human sacrifice. We consider, for example, something like capital punishment. All right, that's something that not all members of our society are on board with, the same way that not all members of the Aztec society were on board with their religious sacrifices. But what are we doing with capital punishment? Okay, we're finding individuals who have been found guilty of horrific crimes. Usually there's this idea that by executing this individual who's such a danger to our society, we're creating safer conditions for our society. All right, so we're willing to sacrifice that life in order to provide safer, better conditions for our society as a whole. Again, I know not everybody agrees with that, but that's the concept of capital punishment that is practiced largely within our society and within several societies around the world. Warfare can even be seen as a form of human sacrifice. You're sending young men to go put their lives quite literally in danger. And the theory is always what? That they're fighting for our freedoms, right? That they're helping protect us from evil forces around the world, or that they're trying to help protect other people of the world. So essentially, they're creating safer, better conditions, in theory at least, by risking their own lives. The point I'm getting at is don't be so quick to assume that we advance so much further along and that we're so much more progressive than these Aztecs who are out committing human sacrifice, because we still have similar practices and justifications very well at play within the 21st century. Okay, so now moving beyond Central and South America, we're going to mosey on up into this region here known as the Southwest Borderlands, also sometimes referred to as the Spanish borderlands in the colonial period, later the Mexican-American borderlands. This refers to areas basically up here north into Texas and into the Southern Plains, down into northern Mexico, all this region right in here that I'm circling with the cursor. Let's take a look at what types of people were living here by 1492. One group we can look at is actually a series of groups referred to as Pueblo societies. These are actually several distinct groups who had similar types of characteristics. They got that word Pueblo from the Spanish. That's the Spanish word for town. And it referred to these settlements that they lived in, all right, because they lived in these mostly sedentary communities, meaning they stayed in a fixed location for long periods of time, all right, while the earlier Puebloan societies, we can see here, built communities kind of mainly out of stone on the sides of mountains that could be abandoned quickly if necessary. They're obviously made to be dwelled in for long periods of time. Right, and then the later Pueblos would create permanent settlements that they could stay in as long as possible. By 1492, Pueblo societies such as the Hopi and the Zuni had adopted elements of earlier peoples who had long histories here in the Southwest by that time, like the Hohokam, who had extensive irrigation and lots of trade, and the ancestral Puebloans who had built societies like this. And the Pueblos by 1492 had constructed very extensive towns with multi-story stone and adobe buildings. The Puebloans depended very heavily on farming. You may be wondering, how the heck are they farming so well in this very arid, dry desert climate of the southwest borderlands in regions like New Mexico and Arizona where they thrived? Well, they did so through that extensive irrigation that they had adopted from earlier people like the Hohokam, right? So they took rivers and surrounding areas and built canals from those rivers into their cities that they could use not only for drinking water, bathing water, etc., but also for things like farming. Their cities were also connected by extensive roadways, like we saw in Central and South America. And these roadways also worked as a basis for extensive trade networks between various Pueblo societies, as well as between Pueblo societies and more migratory groups who also lived in the region, who we'll be looking at next year. So these Pueblo societies were pretty egalitarian by 1492, meaning they lived very communally. All people had similar types of status within society. There was really no individuals who had extensive material wealth beyond what most people had. And by contrast, there was nobody who was really starving and wanting for wealth more than others. They kind of shared their wealth pretty equally, and made sure that everybody had access to food and to the basics without getting too carried away with extravagance. And to this end, many of these Pueblo communities created alliances or confederacies with one another where they could help one another survive by providing each other food in times of drought or military protection from enemies. So, say, for example, one Pueblo city was going through severe drought, but another city a ways away was getting some pretty decent rainfall, so they had more food. They could use their roadways to help provide the struggling city with some food during their time of hardship, under the understanding that when they were going through hard times, when in terms of drought and food, the other city would help take care of them. And this was likely linked, some historians believe, to the Pueblo's history in a place called Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon is where the ancestral Puebloans had survived, but long before 1492, this canyon and society around it had been completely abandoned. All kinds of things probably led to this. Historians believe that extensive drought, which also led to things like starvation, played a huge role in Chaco Canyon being abandoned. Also, very likely attacks, more migratory warlike groups in the region. But these things were also, some historians believe, coupled with the fact that there were some individuals who came to Chaco Canyon and amassed great wealth by collecting tribute from everybody else there. And as these few people were doing so well, everybody else was starving because they were kind of eating up all the wealth and resources of the region at everybody else's expense. And this created this historical lesson for the Puebloan peoples that they needed to learn from their past in Chaco Canyon and not allow for certain individuals to flourish at everybody else's expense, because that would lead to the downfall of their societies the way it had for these great people who once thrived in Chaco Canyon. Alongside these Puebloan societies in the Southwest were the Athapascan societies. Athapascans is a language group. This included groups like the Apaches and the Navajos. These were more warlike bands of hunter-gatherers, and they had extensive trade with the sedentary groups like the Pueblos, and they became pretty dependent on food and trade from the Pueblos for their survival, in addition to their hunting and foraging. Now, this is clearly a very different type of society traveling throughout the Southwest by hunting and raiding and trading with other groups versus those very settled societies that we saw with the Pueblos. So this shows us that even within certain regions of North America by 1492, there were diverse means of coping with similar environments, right? And there were different types of societies living in different ways, even within the same locales in some cases. That sums up the Southwest borderlands pretty quickly. Let's now mosey on over here to the American Southeast. And we're actually going to see that a lot of these communities here in the Southeast were connected to cities further north as well via the Mississippi River. So in the Southeast, there were thriving Mississippian cultures. These were cultures of people who also frequently lived in permanent cities that were connected by vast trade networks along the Mississippi River here. So this connected these southeastern groups to groups much further north and in other parts of the country who were involved in this trade. These were mostly agriculturalists. They thrived on growing the Three Sisters, which were corn, beans, and squash. But they also hunted and fished, all right? Some of them lived in some prime hunting grounds. And of course, living along the Mississippi River, and especially those living here near the Gulf Coast, took advantage of the waterways and the fish that they provided. It's corn. All right, corn was very important to these Mississippian cultures. They lived in centralized chiefdoms, meaning there was a lot of power concentrated within a few individuals in society. So there's a chief, some other political leaders, and also some spiritual leaders who held all the power in society, and all tribute came up to them. I mean, as we'll see, corn was a symbol of status in these Mississippian societies. And the more corn a city had, the more prosperous it was clear that that city was. If you came into a Mississippian community and they had extensive fields of corn, you knew you were coming into a very wealthy city. Well, over time, as these chiefs within these societies began getting more control over various Mississippian communities, they would gather their excess corn as a form of tribute, and they would hold on to it in these centralized storehouses. And then if any cities were suffering through famine or hardship, the centralized chiefs could then distribute out that corn to the struggling societies, and they would see that it's the chief who's providing for them in their times of hardship. At least that's the way it would come across. So this led to increased dependence on this central authority for survival, because people were giving all their excess food to this chief and depending on him to feed them in their hard times. That was in a way for the chief a demonstration of power, but for all the people surrounding it led to a very increased dependence on that central authority to have access to that excess food. A lot of these Mississippian cultures also constructed extensive mounds out of grass and earth. Some of these you can still see evidence of throughout the Southeast and along the Mississippi River. These were frequently topped with homes or important buildings for religious and political leaders. They were also sometimes used as ceremonial centers, or in some cases as mass tombs. There's evidence similar to what we've seen in ancient Egypt of individuals being buried with a great deal of wealth and some of their valuable belongings within these mounds. And the kind of central point of location for all these Mississippian groups along the Mississippi was Cahokia, which is this big city located in Illinois. This was an economic hub and possibly spiritual center for all these groups along the Mississippi. They were traveling in and out, bringing all kinds of goods in and out. And we need to understand that this city was larger than most of the thriving cities in Europe by 1492. And it had very impressive mounds. In the center of the city was Monk's Mound. This was this massive 10-story mound. The base of this mound here was bigger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, all right, to give you reference there. And all these cities and roadworks and mounds we can see now were organized around the patterns of the cosmos, okay, so around the sun and the stars, showing us that there was very advanced knowledge, very advanced astronomical knowledge among these peoples of the Mississippian societies. And it was big cities like Cahokia here that connected the Southeast to the other regions of the Mississippi, right? They would bring their goods in here, trade, and now from here we find goods that were clearly made by the Mississippians in the Southeast scattered throughout North America as a result of people traveling in and out of these big hubs like Cahokia. But another group I want to look at is the Caddos. These were Mississippian peoples who lived in East Texas and surrounding areas. They lived a little differently than most other Mississippian cultures. So as we see by looking at these big cities like Cahokia, a lot of Mississippian cultures were very densely populated. You had a lot of people living together in small spaces. Furthermore, they were all very heavily centralized. Remember, they had those central leaders who would collect all their food and hold it in storehouses and then distribute it back out. And that made them very dependent on that central leadership. Well, the Caddos lived a bit differently. They lived in more dispersed settlements that were kind of loosely united, but not so centralized. They weren't putting all of their food into one collective storehouse. And this gave the Caddos some benefits over the other Mississippians. A lot of these thriving Mississippian cultures were conquered pretty quickly as a result of colonialism and disease spread once Europeans arrived, because they could do things like come into some of these great thriving cities and kill some of their key political leaders or take over some of their centralized storehouses, and it made it very easy for them to take over communities. Furthermore, when Europeans would come into these very densely populated cities and European disease would begin to spread throughout those cities, it would spread very rapidly and a lot of people would die very quickly. But the Caddos, by contrast, living in their less populated, more widely dispersed cities, didn't struggle from disease spread as much. And they also didn't have to worry about the death of a few political leaders or a takeover of one central storehouse having a very big impact on other societies who weren't very closely linked to wherever that might be happening. So this definitely gave the Caddos an upper hand in terms of surviving colonization and colonialism compared to other Mississippian societies. Another pretty fascinating thing about the Caddos that I think is worth noting while we're on the topic of them is they had pretty interesting gender roles. Women in Caddo societies symbolized peace, all right? And they were used in delegations to signify that a certain group of Caddos wanted to make peaceful relations with another group, okay? If a Caddos ever showed up and they just had a bunch of men, you needed to watch how you were stepping because they may have hostile intentions. If they had women show up, then okay, they had peaceful intentions. I don't want to get too lost here in detail, but Caddos had pretty extensive kind of like border patrols in a way. They'd have these rings around their societies where they could send out soldiers and scouts to patrol. And if anybody came too close to a Caddo city, those scouts and soldiers would let people know, hey, we got some people approaching. And delegations of men would go approach whoever was nearby their city and see if they were worth coming into their city. And if they thought these people were somebody they wanted to make peace with, they would make them go through this gradual process of purification and then bring them gradually into their city. And it wasn't until they were sure that these people were purified and worthy of peaceful relations that they were able to have access to Caddo women and children. So once they saw Caddo women and children, that was a clear sign that there was going to be some kind of diplomatic, peaceful relations established. And with this in mind, some historians suggest that the Caddos had a far different understanding of images of the Virgin Mary than the Spanish assumed. Again, perhaps showing us the essence of considering various perspectives when studying history, all right? So the Spanish would show up into places like the Southeast with these big banners of the Virgin Mary, and they'd see that they received all kinds of reverence from certain groups like the Caddos. So from the Spanish perspective, they're showing, oh, we have this great superior religion. They simply see the Holy Mother and they're so inspired by her majestic holy image that they give her great reverence, right? But really what historians suggest is the fact that Caddos saw her not as a great religious symbol, but they saw her as a woman, okay? And they had a great reverence toward women in general as these great signifiers of peace. And when they saw these delegations of mostly men carrying an image of such a revered woman here, it showed them that these men had peaceful intentions. So what they were respectful of here with this image of the Virgin Mary and what they showed a great submission to was that idea of peaceful relations. Okay, now let's move over just a little west, right down to the center of North America, ranging all the way down from northern Texas all the way up into Canada. We're now looking at the Great Plains region. Groups who lived in this region, such as the Blackfeet, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Sioux, were migratory hunters for the most part, who lived in temporary shelters, kind of the traditional teepees. These are the people who place a very heavy emphasis on the importance of bison in their lifestyles. All right, they had a spiritual connection to bison, as well as a very material connection. Right, they used all different parts of bison for different means of survival. All right, so for example, they would use teeth, horns, hooves, things like that, bones for tools and weapons, but then they could also use the hides for clothing or for parts of temporary shelter. In some cases, some of these peoples would even take the male genitalia, we'll say, of bison and use them to make big old walking sticks. I'm not kidding when I say that they were creative with just how much use they could get out of the bison. And they would make good use of the meat as well, eating all kinds of good stuff like tripas, barbacoa, whatever you want to eat, you got it there for you on that big old bison. But as I suggested, there's also a spiritual connection in the sense that the Plains people knew that when they died, they would disintegrate into the earth, and they believed that would make them part of the earth, and then bison would eat the earth. Then these bison in turn would feed the next generation of plains people who would hunt them. So there's kind of this interdependence where they're providing something for one another. Plains people also tended to have a spiritual connection to the sun and to the earth. They believed that there were spirits in pretty much all living things, whether they were trees or grass, even rocks, which aren't living things. They had close connection to a lot of animals, not just bisons, all kinds of animals who they believed that certain wise people could communicate through, or animals could be used by spiritual forces to send symbols and messages to people living here on the plains. They would honor different types of animals as well as the sun and the earth and these different spiritual beings that they felt connected to through various rituals and dances. Place people were also very skilled warriors. They usually organized into smaller kind of clannish bands that would stick together and help defend one another. These societies were sometimes matrilineal, meaning that things like power and status would flow through a person's mother, and that the status of a clan or a kinship network or a family would be based around the woman's family. In other cases, they were patrilineal, meaning that all those things would flow through the men, and the status of a person's father was going to influence their status. All right. So in a matrilineal society, for example, men would usually marry into the women's family. And if a woman was somebody of importance, then her children would inherit that importance. And in a patrilineal society, the opposite would be true. Women would marry into men's family, and any kind of influence that a man might have would be passed on to his children. And these Plains tribes, I want us to understand, are the groups that later down the road tend to become the stereotypical image of the American Indian. The hunters on the Great Plains riding on horseback. Of course, they didn't have any horses at this point, but once Europeans arrived, they became very skilled on horseback. Also, want us to understand that there's a good bit of overlap between these groups in the plains and the Athapascan groups that we were looking at down in the southwest borderlands region, because that is down into the southern part of the plains. So groups like the Apaches would actually fit somewhat within these Great Plains nations. All right, so we've seen some thriving civilizations in Central and South America, the southwest borderlands, the southeast, and along the Mississippi River, throughout the Great Plains. Now I want to look over here in the northeast woodlands. Again, we're just scratching the surface here. There are some southern woodlands groups as well. Groups like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creeks, and Seminoles, who later down the road will be called the quote unquote five civilized tribes, all resided down here in the southern woodlands and lived in somewhat similar lifestyles to these groups in the northeast. These groups who lived east of the Mississippi in the northern woodlands included groups like the Iroquois, Narragansett, Huron, Wampanoag, and Pequots. We'll see a lot of these groups would have early contact with English colonists later down the road. They lived in pretty sedentary communities. It was pretty common for families to live together in these long houses made of wood, taking advantage of living in the woodlands area. They practiced pretty extensive farming in these sedentary communities, growing things like corn, beans, and squash, those three sisters. But they also had extensive hunting within their societies. Their societies were mostly matrilineal, again, meaning power and status would flow through the line of women. So if a woman was a person of great importance in, say, Iroquois society, then her children would inherit that status. And if a man married a woman, he would move into her family's longhouse. He would marry into her family, right? That's a matrilineal society. The Northeast Woodlands groups also had some pretty complex political structures. They had a series of confederacies, meaning loosely unified groups where there are several representatives who really hold authority, who loosely come together and kind of collaborate in certain ways. And they would meet together on various councils. Great example we can see is the Iroquois Confederacy, which had a council of representatives from all the 5 and later 6 nations that made up the Iroquois. And the leaders who would represent these various nations in the councils were known as sachems. Sachems were kind of a blend between political leaders who also had a spiritual and medicinal influence. What we need to understand is these sachems and these types of groups, and this was similar in other groups in other parts of North America as well, is that they led not through direct force or by a very firm authority. They led more by example. right? So they were wise, revered individuals within their society who people looked up to and trusted, and they would offer their advice in certain matters. They could say, hey, I think it's not in our best interest to go to war with this particular band over here, or maybe it is in our best interest to go into war. And they could even bring in their great wisdom, saying, I have seen signs from the great spirits sending me different animals to give me an omen to let me know why this is or is not in our best interest to do this. But it was really up to the other individuals within the community to decide whether or not they were going to follow through with the advice offered by these sachems. And this Iroquois Confederacy, I also want us to understand, is pretty fascinating. Again, it's made up of the representatives of the various Iroquois nations who would come together and meet in a council, but it wasn't a kind of type of council where they would say, okay, we all need to agree on this one thing and that's what we're all going to do. They're not just setting mandates for one another, they're coming together and having conversation and offering advice to one another, helping each other resolve disputes, helping each other see better ways of possibly doing things. Okay. Overall, these northeastern woodland societies, such as the Iroquois, had pretty democratic political systems because there are these wise leaders that are giving them advice, but for the most part, it's up to the people themselves to make whatever decisions they're going to make. Very fascinating gender roles as well within the northeastern woodland societies. So if we look, for example, to the Iroquois, men were the ones going out and hunting, representing the political side of things by serving in the on the council and being members of the Iroquois Confederacy. Women largely were responsible for the domestic sphere, okay, doing things like caring for the home, child rearing, but they also had the responsibility of farming, right, tending to crops. So if we consider who really had power in Iroquois society, of course, men do just to some extent, right? They're the ones going and representing their nation in the council, offering the great advice. They're going out and hunting. But while they're away doing all these things, who's really calling the shots here on the home front? It's the women, right? They're the ones who on the day to day are there in the towns and villages and calling the shots of what's going to happen when the men are gone. The women also had a lot of indirect influence in the sense that they could do things like indirectly declare war. There's a series of conflicts within early Iroquois society known as the mourning wars. What those refer to is mourning, as in grieving over the loss of a loved one. Um, and these got their name because Iroquois women had this power to demand a replacement for any child that they lost. Okay, so say, for example, a neighboring indigenous nation abducted or killed this woman's 6-year-old child. She could say, okay, well, I now want a replacement 6-year-old child. And the men in her society would have a duty to produce her this replacement child. And where are they just going to come up with a child? They're going to have to go abduct it from another neighboring indigenous nation. Most likely, they're going to go get it from the nation who abducted the child from them or killed the child, who whatever the situation may be in the first place. And as you might imagine, anybody who has kids or has younger siblings, or even nieces or nephews, or maybe even little cousins, as much as they drive you nuts, if somebody came and tried to take them from you, you are going to fight tooth and nail and do everything you can to protect those kids. And that's what would happen here. Okay. And that would lead to warfare. So, as these women would say, bring me a replacement child, men would go try to abduct a child from another nation. That nation would fight to defend their children or to try to take them back. And this would lead to war. So, we're seeing indirectly women were calling for war in some cases. And they were the ones really calling that shot in a very indirect way. Pretty fascinating. Again, though, guys, we've just really scratched the surface here. There's groups much further up into present day Canada, groups over in the Northwest, the Southeast Woodlands people, all kinds of peoples we have not really been able to get into here because we'd be here all day long trying to cover this. So what's the main point here I want us to understand? By 1492, when you know who sailed the ocean blue, whoop-de-do, and the Europeans started colonizing North America, decided to call it a quote unquote new world, this was already a vastly populated, thriving set of continents with a very long history and very complex societies of people living different ways, right? So I'll leave it up to you to consider where or not there may be some accuracy considering the America's a New World by 1492 based on the evidence at hand. You have any questions about this? You know who to ask. I'm your guy. Otherwise, this is it for now. Over and out.